Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Louisiana. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year most often attached to this file is 1854, though the ink on the earliest ledger suggests the events began slightly earlier, perhaps in the wet spring before the heat fully settled over the lower parishes. The plantation sat far from the main river road, reached only by a narrow spur trail that vanished into cypress and scrub oak. County maps marked the land simply as R. Beauregard Holding, with no further detail. Travelers who passed near it noted the stillness first, the absence of birds, the way dogs refused to go farther than the first fence line. According to a parish clerk named Lucian Mara, who later copied fragments of the estate inventory by lamplight, the property had changed hands 3 times since the 1820s. Each transfer followed a death, none of them well explained. The land outlived its owners, Mara wrote in the margin, and seemed content to do so. By the time the final owner arrived, records list him only as Mr. R.B. The surrounding settlements already spoke of the place as unsettled. Mr. R.B. arrived with little furniture, several hired men, and a curious shipment logged by the New Orleans wharf master as livestock, crates reinforced. What kind of livestock was never specified. One dockhand later testified that the crates breathed. Another claimed he heard coughing that sounded almost human. These statements were dismissed as drink-fueled exaggerations, yet they were preserved in an affidavit after the events that followed. Early correspondence places R.B. as a man of education, familiar with natural histories circulating at the time. One letter mentions his interest in large cats of the southern frontier, animals that naturalists elsewhere were beginning to catalog, creatures later grouped under what we now call the Florida panther. In the 1850s, however, such animals were poorly understood, often reduced to superstition or frontier rumor. The plantation's first season passed quietly. Neighbors noted torchlight moving through the outer fields at odd hours and heard deep, resonant calls after dusk, sounds not matching wolf or bear. A freedman named Isaiah Cole, questioned years later, recalled being hired briefly and leaving without pay. Whatever he kept back there, Cole said, it wasn't meant for daylight. The party that ended everything was planned for late summer, timed after the cane harvest. Invitations survive in fragmentary form, written in a formal hand. Music, drink, and an exhibition of uncommon stock were promised. Rain fell steadily that evening, according to a Methodist minister who declined to attend. By midnight, screams carried across the wetlands, followed by gunfire, then silence. By dawn, the road was empty. Guests did not return home. The plantation gates stood open, and from the tree line, parish trackers reported fresh prints, large, rounded, and far too numerous to belong to any single beast. The first men sent to the plantation that morning were not lawmen but relatives, brothers, cousins, in-laws, riding ahead of any official notice. They found the yard torn into irregular channels as though plows had been dragged sideways through the soil. Tables lay overturned. Bottles were shattered, their contents soaked into the dirt. No bodies were visible at first. only scraps of cloth caught in thorns and a hat pinned beneath a broken chair leg. When the parish constable, Etienne Roussel, arrived before noon, he ordered the ground searched in widening circles. His notes, later summarized in a court ledger, described tracks consistent with great cats, of a kind seldom seen in this region, appearing and vanishing unpredictably. Roussel had served near the Florida border in his youth and wrote that the prints resembled those attributed to the panthers of the southern forests, animals that naturalists were only beginning to define with any clarity. Inside the main house, the damage was worse. Claw marks scored the plaster walls. Heavy drapes had been shredded as if deliberately. In the dining room, blood pooled beneath the table, but no remains were found. A single violin lay broken near the hearth, its strings pulled free. The hired men were gone. So was Mr. R.B. A shallow pit was discovered behind the smokehouse late that afternoon. The soil had been recently turned, though no one claimed knowledge of the work. When opened, the pit revealed bones stripped nearly clean, arranged in no clear order. Dr. Alphonse Dupré, summoned from a neighboring parish, recorded that the marks on the bones were consistent with animal dentition, though of a size and force exceeding that of known wolves. He declined to speculate further. Rumors traveled faster than official findings. By the second day, nearby settlements were repeating a story that R.B. had trained panthers to attack on command, releasing them as part of the promised exhibition. Others insisted the animals escaped accidentally. A few claimed something worse, that the beasts had been starved deliberately, taught to associate music and lantern light with feeding. Roussel dismissed these tales publicly, but his private journal, later recovered among his papers, tells a different story. He wrote of hearing low calls at night while guarding the site, and of eyes reflecting lantern light beyond the fields. They did not flee, he noted. They watched. Search parties found crates in a locked outbuilding, their interiors scratched raw. Chains lay broken on the floor. A ledger, water-damaged but legible in places, listed feed quantities inconsistent with cattle or hogs. The names of naturalists appeared in the margins, alongside references to southern cats similar to those later classified as Florida panthers. By the third week, the official search was suspended. No arrests were made. R.B. was declared missing, not dead. The plantation was abandoned by order of the parish council, its records sealed after a small fire destroyed part of the archive. An accident, according to the clerk. Years later, travelers still reported hearing calls near the old road. Children were warned not to wander near the ruins. And in the margins of a natural history pamphlet printed in 1861, an anonymous reader wrote a single line: "They were never all accounted for." What unsettled the parish council most was not the violence itself, but the absence of certainty. No eyewitness could place a single moment when the gathering turned. No one agreed on how many guests had attended. Even the invitations conflicted, some listing a modest supper, others hinting at a far larger affair. It was as if the night had fractured into overlapping versions, none complete. In the weeks following the abandonment, affidavits were collected quietly. One came from a woman named Celeste Fournier, who lived nearly 2 miles away along a bayou bend. She claimed that on the night of the party, the wind carried music longer than expected. It went on past midnight, she said, then stopped all at once, like a breath held too long. Moments later, she heard what she described as a chorus of cries, low and high together. She barred her doors and did not look outside again until morning. Another statement, taken from a stable hand passing through the parish days later, mentioned lanterns moving erratically along the tree line, followed by gunshots fired without rhythm or command. The man swore he heard something respond to the shots, not retreating, but advancing. Constable Roussel attempted to reconstruct the sequence using physical evidence alone. The ground suggested movement outward from the house rather than inward. Tracks overlapped chaotically, some ending abruptly, others circling back. Several prints were found on the veranda itself. Roussel noted that whatever animals made them were unafraid of human structures. Midway through the inquiry, a packet of letters surfaced, sent years earlier by R.B. to a bookseller in Mobile. They referenced imported writings on animal conditioning and frontier accounts of large cats in the Southern Territories, creatures akin to what later scholars would classify among the Florida panther population. One line underlined twice read, "Fear is learned, hunger is taught." The letters vanished soon after being logged, reportedly misplaced during the transfer to parish storage. Their disappearance fed speculation that certain findings were deliberately suppressed. A junior clerk later claimed the council feared panic more than truth. If people believed beasts could be turned against them, he said, they would never sleep easy again. By early autumn, the plantation buildings began to decay rapidly. Shingles fell. Vines overtook the outer fences. Hunters avoided the area after several dogs refused to track game near the site, whining and pulling back toward the road. One hunter claimed to find a partially buried chain deep in the woods, too heavy for any known animal to drag far. No trace of R.B. was ever confirmed. Some believed he fled west under an assumed name. Others insisted he never left the property alive. The case file was closed without resolution, categorized as a fatal disturbance involving wild animals. Yet years later, a traveling lecturer on natural history passing through Louisiana in the late 1860s noted in his journal that local guides refused to camp near the old Beauregard land. They told him the cats there did not behave like animals. They waited. By the time winter settled over the parish, what remained of the plantation existed mostly on paper. The land itself was left to rot in plain sight, a warning without words. Official maps began omitting its name, marking the acreage as unassigned, as if erasing the label might quiet the memory. But memories, like roots, have a way of pushing back through disturbed ground. In 1855, a year after the gathering, a surveyor named Thomas Klein was commissioned to reassess nearby boundaries. His journal, preserved by his family, records a brief and troubling entry. He wrote of reaching the perimeter fence just before dusk and feeling watched. Not birds, he clarified. Too patient, too aware. He abandoned the work before finishing, citing illness, though his descendants said he remained healthy for decades after. Around this time, local newspapers began running small notices: livestock missing, dogs found mauled, tracks discovered near smokehouses. None of these reports mentioned the plantation directly, but the geography made the connection unavoidable. Parish officials insisted the incidents were unrelated, attributing them to feral animals displaced by logging farther south. A former deputy, Jules Marin, later testified that he and Roussel had debated the true scale of what escaped that night. Marin believed there were more animals than crates accounted for. He recalled finding feed ledgers showing rations sufficient for at least half a dozen large cats, possibly more. He didn't keep them like pets, Marin said of RB. He kept them like tools. Midway through the decade, a traveling physician named Dr. Henry Vallon published a short medical note in a regional journal, describing wounds found on two bodies recovered from swamp land miles apart. The injuries were consistent, he wrote, with attack by a large feline species. Vallon noted the oddity that such animals were rarely seen in settled Louisiana, unlike the more documented panther populations farther east, such as those later described in Florida. Though Vallon did not name the plantation, parish readers understood the implication. Copies of the journal reportedly went missing from the local library within weeks. Folklore began to take hold where records failed. Children spoke of a man who whistled at night and was answered from the woods. Others claimed the cats wore iron rings around their necks, remnants of broken chains. An elderly woman swore she saw torchlight moving through the ruins long after no one lived there, followed by the sound of something pacing beneath the floorboards. Roussel retired quietly in 1857. In his final notes, he questioned whether the animals had been trained to attack indiscriminately or selectively. What if, he wrote, they were taught to recognize a signal we never identified? The notebook ends abruptly, several pages torn free. By the early 1860s, the site was largely reclaimed by forest, yet travelers continued to detour around it. They said the air felt heavier there, the silence deliberate. And sometimes, just before dawn, they heard a low call rolling across the fields, unanswered. The war years complicated what little remained of the record. As men and materials were drawn away, parish files were boxed, moved, and sometimes lost entirely. In one transfer, a fire broke out in a storage room near the courthouse. Officially, the damage was minimal. Unofficially, several documents tied to the abandoned plantation were never seen again. A clerk later remarked that the smoke seemed to know where to linger. Despite the upheaval, the land itself continued to intrude upon local life. Soldiers marching through the region avoided camping near the old road, preferring longer routes through open ground. One unit's quartermaster noted in his log that mules refused to drink from a nearby stream, though no visible contamination was found. At night, sentries reported movement at the tree line, shapes that did not advance, yet never withdrew. In 1864, a Confederate courier vanished while traveling alone. His satchel was recovered days later, torn open, its contents scattered but untouched by water. The only mark on the leather was a series of punctures arranged in pairs. The incident was dismissed as enemy action, though no human tracks were found nearby. After the war, attempts were made to sell the land. Each failed. Prospective buyers visited once and declined without explanation. One man from Baton Rouge wrote to the parish office stating only that the ground remembered things it should not. The letter was filed without comment. A decade after the original incident, Dr. Vallon revisited his earlier notes while preparing a broader treatise on animal attacks. He referenced the Louisiana cases again, comparing them to documented behavior of large cats in the southeastern forests, including the panther populations described in Florida Natural Histories. Vallon concluded that the pattern suggested conditioning rather than chance encounters. The passage was removed in later printings. Oral accounts from freed families who settled nearby added another layer. They spoke of hearing whistles carried on the wind, short, deliberate tones, followed by movement through brush. These stories were never written down formally, but they persisted, shared quietly and with caution. By the late 1870s, the plantation ruins were nearly indistinguishable from the forest. Only the foundation stones remained, half buried and cracked. Hunters reported finding old chains fused with rust, too heavy to carry far. None attempted to remove them. In 1883, a professor from New Orleans visited the site with students, hoping to document regional folklore. He left early. In his journal, he wrote, "The animals may be gone, the practice may not be." Even as decades passed, no official conclusion was reached. The case remained open only in rumor, its edges blurred by time. And yet those who traveled near the land at night continued to quicken their pace, listening for sounds they hoped would never come closer. By the closing years of the 1880s, the story had settled into something like accepted absence. New families moved into the parish who had never heard the name Beauregard spoken aloud. Roads shifted. Property lines were redrawn. Yet the old spur trail remained, faint but stubborn, refusing to disappear entirely beneath grass and moss. It was during this period that a small, leather-bound journal surfaced in a private estate sale in St. Francisville. The book bore no author's name, only initials pressed into the cover. R.B. Its contents were fragmentary, whether observations, feeding schedules, notes on sound and response. One passage, dated several months before the 1854 gathering, described the animals reacting differently to voices versus instruments. "The violin unsettles them," the writer observed. "Brass steadies. Silence excites." The journal changed hands twice before vanishing again. A local schoolteacher who read portions of it later recounted a final line that troubled her. "They no longer wait for hunger." No effort was made to authenticate the journal formally. By then, the parish preferred distance to certainty. Around the same time, hunters began reporting a decline in deer near the abandoned land, though no increase was noted elsewhere. Tracks still appeared after heavy rain, large, round impressions that did not match bear or wolf. A naturalist passing through remarked that if panthers were present, they behaved unlike those described in contemporary studies of Florida populations, which tended to avoid human settlement. In 1891, a fire swept through a stand of trees near the old foundation stones. Afterward, charred remains revealed a shallow cavity beneath the house site, possibly a cellar or holding pen. No formal excavation followed. The landowner at the time, who held the title only on paper, requested the site be reburied. The last official mention in parish minutes came in 1902, when a road proposal was quietly rerouted to avoid the area. No reason was given. A councilman later told his son that some ground does not improve with traffic. Even into the early years of the new century, travelers claimed unease when passing nearby. Horses shied, dogs went silent, and sometimes just before night fully settled, a low call rolled across the fields, deep, measured, and unanswered. The case was never reopened. No graves were marked, no names added to ledgers. What remained was a stretch of Louisiana earth that resisted explanation, holding its silence carefully. And to this day, locals say the woods there listen back. In the years just after 1904, the plantation land entered a strange kind of administrative limbo. Taxes were paid irregularly by distant holders who never visited. Deeds were transferred through intermediaries who listed no intention of development. On paper, the property existed. On foot, few were willing to approach it. A young parish recorder named Emile Thibodeaux attempted to compile a retrospective report on unresolved cases before his retirement. In his notes, he referred to the 1854 incident obliquely, calling it the gathering that erased itself. He complained that entire folders were missing, others reduced to single pages with corners burned away. One surviving scrap referenced an expense request for reinforced restraints, denied after the fact as unnecessary. Thibodeaux interviewed elderly residents, some of whom had been children at the time. Their recollections were hesitant, often contradicting one another, yet they shared certain features. All remembered warnings not to wander near the old road. All recalled adults lowering their voices when the subject arose. One man, nearly 90, said his father believed the animals had been dispersed deliberately after the incident, driven into surrounding wetlands where they adapted and survived. During this period, natural history societies were publishing more systematic studies of large cats in the American South. The Florida panther, as it came to be known, was increasingly documented as elusive, solitary, and wary of humans. Several readers wrote letters to editors questioning how such animals could account for coordinated attacks described in older, anonymous reports from Louisiana. Those letters went unanswered. In 1908, a railway survey team briefly camped within sight of the abandoned spur trail. Their foreman later filed a complaint citing persistent nocturnal disturbances. He described pacing sounds around the camp perimeter that stopped whenever lanterns were raised. No animals were seen. The crew relocated after 3 nights. The final personal testimony came from Sister Marguerite, a nun who ran a small school nearby. She wrote in a private letter that children sometimes came to class exhausted after nights of poor sleep. When asked why, they spoke of dreams filled with watching eyes and distant calls. She dismissed the accounts as shared imagination, yet admitted she herself avoided evening walks near the old boundary. By 1910, the parish had grown accustomed to the silence surrounding the land. It was no longer feared openly, only bypassed. No monuments marked what happened. No official inquiry revisited it. The case remained unfinished by design or by exhaustion. And so the story closed not with answers, but with avoidance. An understanding passed quietly from one generation to the next that some places in Louisiana were better left unexamined, lest they remember you in return. The approach of the second decade of the century brought new residents and new names to the parish rolls, but the land itself resisted reinvention. Survey markers placed too close to the old spur trail were repeatedly found disturbed, not uprooted, simply laid flat, as if pressed down by weight. The incidents were attributed to erosion, though no heavy rains were recorded on the days in question. In 1912, a graduate student from Chilean traveled through the region collecting oral histories for a thesis on frontier violence. His notes, preserved in family papers, reveal frustration. "People speak," he wrote, "but never fully, they circle." When he asked directly about the plantation gathering of 1854, several interviewees ended the conversation abruptly. One elderly woman advised him to leave before dusk. The student did manage to record a single detailed account from a man whose grandfather had been a hired hand. According to this testimony, the animals were not released all at once. They were guided. Whistles were used, pitched differently for each enclosure. Music was meant to demonstrate control, not spectacle. When panic broke that control, nothing remained to stop them. This account contradicted earlier official claims that the animals escaped accidentally. It also suggested forethought, planning, and rehearsal. Yet without documents, the story remained conjecture. Around this time, a regional journal published a retrospective comparing unresolved animal attacks across the southern states. The Louisiana case was mentioned briefly, contrasted with better documented encounters involving Florida panthers. The author noted that the Louisiana reports described behaviors inconsistent with known solitary hunting patterns, but offered no explanation. The land changed hands once more in 1914. The new owner never visited, relying on tenants who grazed cattle at a distance. None stayed long. One tenant abandoned his lease after finding his herd clustered tightly together at night, refusing to spread out even when feed was scarce. The final known incident occurred in 1916, when two boys exploring the woods returned home shaken and silent. They reported seeing lines in the dirt, parallel and deep, leading away from the old foundation stones. No adults accompanied them back to verify the claim. By the time parish records passed the 50-year mark from the original event, the file was quietly closed again, marked unresolved and unfit for further review. There would be no modern reassessment, no official legacy. Only the land remained, quiet, unclaimed, and still avoided. And even now, those who pass nearby swear that Louisiana nights grow heavier there, as if something waits, listening for a signal that never comes. What survives beyond 1916 is not record but residue. Parish archives from the following years contain no further mentions of the land, yet marginal notes appear in unrelated files, references to that tract, or the place east of the Cypress Break. The clerks seemed to assume mutual understanding, as though naming it directly might invite attention. A traveling folklorist passing through Louisiana in the late 1910s collected regional stories for a small press publication. One entry, attributed to an unnamed informant, spoke of trained shadows, left behind after a failed demonstration of power. The folklorist noted that the story resisted embellishment. Each telling was restrained, careful, almost procedural. He attempted to trace the tale back to its origin and found only absences: burned letters, missing parish logs, and one librarian who claimed a box of relevant newspapers had been misplaced decades earlier. "It is as if the event was edited out," he wrote, "but the edit was imperfect." By this time, scientific understanding of large cats in the South had advanced considerably. Studies of the Florida panther emphasized isolation, territorial range, and avoidance of human disturbance. The folklorist remarked on the contrast between those findings and the Louisiana accounts, which implied coordination, persistence, and learned behavior. He offered no theory, only the observation that conditioning can outlast its creator. Local fishermen continued to avoid certain stretches of bayou near the old road. Nets came up torn when cast too close. At night, the water reflected movement that did not break the surface. When questioned, the men shrugged and said the currents there were confused. The plantation ruins themselves were nearly gone by then, stones carried off for other building projects or swallowed by undergrowth. Yet even stripped of structure, the site retained its boundary. Crops planted too near failed unpredictably. Fires lit nearby burned low and uneven. One final letter, dated 1918, survives in a private collection. It was written by a school inspector passing through the parish. In it, he described stopping briefly near the abandoned land and feeling an urge to leave without knowing why. "It felt observed," he wrote, "not by anything present but by something remembered." After that, the trail fades entirely. No further testimonies, no sightings officially recorded. The case file ends not with a conclusion, but with a margin note added by an unknown hand. Some experiments do not end when their author disappears. And in Louisiana, the silence that followed proved just as enduring. When later readers encountered the file, what struck them most was how abruptly it stopped speaking in dates. After a certain point, the handwriting grew cautious, as if even time itself had become something to avoid invoking. Entries shifted from reports to impressions, from measurements to atmosphere. It was no longer clear who was recording and who was simply listening. One such note, written in a steady but unfamiliar hand, described walking the perimeter of the old land at first light. The writer did not claim to see anything unusual. Instead, he focused on what failed to appear: no birdsong, no insects. Even the wind, he said, seemed to redirect itself around the clearing. "It is not abandoned," the note concluded. "It is occupied by absence." Fragments of earlier testimony were recopied into the margins, sometimes with corrections. A quote attributed to Constable Roussel, "They watched," was underlined twice. Another from Dr. Dupre's bone analysis was followed by a single question mark, as if the reader was reconsidering conclusions once thought settled. One page listed names of those present at the gathering, crossed out unevenly. Next to several names were small symbols resembling tally marks, though their meaning was never explained. Whether these represented confirmed deaths, disappearances, or something else entirely remains unclear. The Florida panther was referenced again in these late notes, not as an explanation but as a point of contrast. The writer observed that known panther behavior did not account for what witnesses described: animals lingering, returning, responding. These were not encounters. the note read. They were interactions. A final attempt at order appears in the form of a map sketch. The plantation site is drawn without buildings, only contours. Lines radiate outward into the woods, stopping abruptly at irregular intervals. Along one line, a small notation reads, range. Along another, habit. The uncertainty is evident. No official seal closes the document. No signature certifies its accuracy. It simply ends, as though the compiler decided that adding more might worsen what already existed. Those who later handled the papers reported a faint odor clinging to them. Old leather, damp earth, something metallic. Archivists dismissed this as storage conditions. Yet more than one admitted they felt uneasy working with the material for long. And so the case remains not as a solved incident, but as a presence. Thin, persistent, resistant to summary. In Louisiana, the land where it began still lies quiet, its story incomplete, its boundaries intact. Travelers pass without stopping. Records remain sealed or missing. And whatever once answered the whistle there has never been fully accounted for, only avoided, as if waiting were its natural state. In the absence of new events, attention turned inward, to the reliability of memory itself. A small circle of parish officials debated, in private correspondence, whether the file should be formally destroyed. One letter argued that incomplete records invite invention. Another warned that erasure only sharpens curiosity. The matter was postponed, and like so many things connected to the land, quietly left unresolved. A retired clerk named Adrien Leblanc spent his final years copying select passages from older case files into personal notebooks. His family later found several pages devoted to the plantation incident. Leblanc did not add commentary. He only rearranged excerpts, placing eyewitness statements alongside inventory lists and medical notes. The effect was unsettling. Ordinary language, when set against itself, seemed to imply intent where none had been proven. One copied line described the animals as restless when confined. Another noted that restraints were checked daily. A third mentioned conditioning trials conducted after dusk. None of these entries alone established wrongdoing. Together, they suggested a process rather than an accident. Leblanc underlined a reference to southern panthers. Again, those same large cats increasingly documented in Florida and neighboring regions. He added a marginal note. If solitary by nature, then what changed? The question went unanswered. Visitors to the parish in the early 1920s occasionally remarked on the peculiar avoidance of a certain stretch of land. They were told only that the soil there was poor, the drainage unreliable. No one mentioned the gathering. No one mentioned animals. Silence had become the official explanation. Yet silence has texture. A school survey conducted in 1924 recorded that children living closest to the area reported higher instances of night terrors. The surveyor attributed this to isolation and folklore. Still, he noted that the dreams shared common elements: being watched, being guided, being herded without understanding how. The last physical artifact connected to the case surfaced briefly in 1927, a rusted iron collar discovered during ditch work miles from the original site. It was too large for any dog and bore deep grooves along the inner edge. The collar was photographed, measured, and then misplaced before further analysis. Its origin was never officially linked to the plantation. As decades pressed on, the land itself resisted classification. It was not cursed, locals insisted. It was simply attentive. Hunters avoided it not out of fear but respect. You don't step into a room where something's still listening, one man explained. By the time the parish reached the limits of its own institutional memory, the case had become less a question of what happened and more a lesson in restraint. Certain experiments, if conducted in isolation and secrecy, leave behind patterns rather than answers. And so the file closes again, not with certainty, but with caution. In Louisiana, the woods where the plantation once stood remain intact, their silence undisturbed. No markers guide you there. No signs warn you away. Only the understanding, passed quietly, without instruction, that some places remember signals long after the hand that gave them is gone. By the early 1930s, the story existed almost entirely as an absence passed between generations. Younger residents knew the land by reputation rather than by name. They learned which paths not to take, which shortcuts were never suggested. When asked why, older voices answered with phrases instead of explanations. It doesn't lead anywhere. Nothing grows right there. Best not to disturb it. A regional geographer visiting Louisiana during that period attempted to catalog unused land parcels. His field notes mention the tract only once, describing it as curiously intact amid surrounding development. He remarked that no fences enclosed it, yet no neighboring plots encroached. The boundary held without enforcement. He moved on without comment. In private collections, however, the case continued to surface in fragments. A descendant of Dr. Dupré discovered his grandfather's medical notes tucked inside a family Bible. The entries reiterated earlier observations: cleanly stripped bones, crushing force, absence of scavenger interference. In the margin, Dupré had added a line not found in official reports. The pattern suggests familiarity, not frenzy. That phrase drew quiet attention among a small circle of physicians and historians who reviewed old cases for academic interest. One compared it to documented incidents involving trained animals in traveling exhibitions. Another noted the difference. Those animals broke free and fled. These, according to the Louisiana accounts, remained. The Florida panther appeared again in correspondence from this period, now firmly categorized by naturalists as elusive and solitary. One scholar wrote that if such an animal had been present in numbers, it would have required extraordinary circumstances. He underlined the word circumstances twice and left it at that. Local folklore adapted as it always does, shedding specifics while preserving shape. The story became less about a man and more about a practice. Children spoke of a place where animals learned to listen. Elders corrected them gently, saying only that some knowledge should not be repeated aloud. The land itself showed no signs of disturbance. Storms passed without felling its oldest trees. Fires burned around it, never through it. Hunters swore the game there moved differently, alert even when unpursued. No new records were added. No investigations reopened. The silence had proven effective. Yet the case endured not because it was retold, but because it was avoided. Each decision not to speak became part of its preservation. And so, in Louisiana, the place where the gathering ended in blood remained unmarked and unnamed, its story incomplete by choice. Those who passed nearby felt it not as fear, but as restraint, an unspoken agreement between land and memory to leave certain signals unanswered. As the middle of the century approached, the parish itself changed character. Roads were paved, schools consolidated, oral histories were replaced by standardized curricula that favored progress over anomaly. What could not be verified was quietly set aside. Yet even as the region modernized, the land at the center of the old case resisted reinterpretation. A forestry initiative in the late 1930s proposed selective logging near the abandoned tract. Preliminary surveys were conducted at a distance. One report noted unusually dense undergrowth and irregular animal paths that did not correspond to known migration patterns. The proposal was revised, then withdrawn, citing logistical inefficiency. Among private letters exchanged by surveyors was a brief remark that stood out. Whatever shaped those paths is still shaping them. The comment was never expanded upon. During this period, a retired naturalist revisited his earlier work on southern predators. In a footnote to a later edition, he referenced an unnamed Louisiana case involving panther-like animals exhibiting learned behavior inconsistent with established studies, including those on the Florida panther. He offered no explanation, only a warning against assuming instinct where conditioning may have occurred. The final living witnesses were gone by then. What remained were second-hand impressions and inherited caution. Children learned not through instruction, but observation, by watching which places adults chose not to enter. In 1941, a brief article in a regional historical bulletin attempted to summarize the 1854 incident. It relied heavily on redacted records and omitted the more troubling details. The editor later admitted the piece felt incomplete, but he could find no sources willing to fill the gaps. A handwritten note was found tucked into one surviving copy of the bulletin years later. It read, "Incomplete is the point." Even in silence, the land continued to exert influence. Weather stations nearby recorded minor but persistent anomalies, shifts in wind direction, sudden temperature drops localized to the area. Meteorologists dismissed these as topographical quirks. By the time the 50-year window from the original event had long passed, the case had ceased to exist officially. Yet unofficially, it endured in avoidance patterns, altered routes, and quiet decisions made without discussion. And still in Louisiana, those who traveled near the old boundaries sensed something unfinished. Not active, not threatening, but attentive, as though the land itself remained conditioned to listen, waiting for a signal no one dared to give. By the mid-1940s, the story no longer belonged to those who had lived through it. It belonged instead to the margins, to annotations, to footnotes, to conversations that stopped when a room grew too quiet. The land itself remained unchanged, a dark green absence on updated parish maps, still marked as undeveloped without explanation. A state archivist reviewing historical land use in Louisiana made a brief visit in 1946. His official report recorded nothing unusual. His personal diary, however, told a different story. He wrote of standing near the tree line and feeling a persistent pressure, as though sound itself were being measured. He left without completing his survey. In correspondence with a colleague, the archivist wondered whether repeated human attention, surveying, testing, listening, might itself have become a stimulus. He speculated that conditioning, once established, could be reinforced unintentionally. The letter was never sent. Around the same time, a small fire burned through a nearby homestead. The family claimed they fled after hearing movement around the house at night, slow and deliberate. Investigators found no cause for the fire. The family relocated permanently. Academic interest in animal behavior was shifting then, moving toward controlled laboratory studies. Older field accounts were increasingly dismissed as unreliable. Yet one professor teaching comparative behavior mentioned an unnamed Louisiana case to his students as a cautionary example. Environment, he said, can be shaped to listen back. The Florida panther appeared once more in his lecture notes, used as a baseline species whose documented traits did not align with the coordinated behaviors described in the old accounts. He warned students against assuming that observed behavior always reflected natural disposition. By 1949, the land was effectively sealed off by disuse. Paths faded completely. What remained was forest uninterrupted by trail or fence, as though nature itself had agreed to preserve the boundary. Those who lived nearby continued to report unease, though fewer spoke of it openly. It was not fear, they said, but awareness, an impression of being accounted for when passing too close. The case had become something other than a crime or an incident. It was a lesson embedded in geography. In Louisiana, the place endured not because it was remembered clearly, but because it was never fully forgotten. And still, no one tested whether the silence would answer. By the early 1950s, the plantation no longer appeared in conversation even as an omission. It had become implicit, a blank that shaped how people moved without being named. New generations accepted detours without asking why. Old roads curved where straight lines would have been easier. A regional historian compiling parish land histories attempted to account for every abandoned property. When he reached the tract in question, his notes grew thin. He wrote only that ownership had passed through uninterested hands, and that no economic rationale explained its continued isolation. In the margin, he added a hesitant remark: non-use can be deliberate. That same year, a group of graduate students studying folklore requested permission to camp near the area. Their request was denied without explanation. One of the students later wrote that the refusal felt less like authority and more like concern. As though we were being spared something, she said. Occasionally, fragments of the older story resurfaced in altered form. A radio host recounting regional legends spoke of a man who taught animals to recognize sound as instruction. The host framed it as allegory. Listeners from the parish wrote in asking that the story not be repeated. Scientific literature had moved on, yet the contrast remained unresolved. The Florida panther, now well documented, did not behave as the Louisiana animals were said to have behaved. This gap, between what was known and what had been reported, was never reconciled. It simply persisted. A final anecdote from this period describes a storm that passed unevenly over the region, dropping rain everywhere except the old tract. Meteorologists offered explanations. Locals did not. The land remained quiet, not empty, quiet in the sense of restraint. Those who lived near it described a sense of being measured when they passed, as though movement itself were noted. And so the story endured without reinforcement, sustained by avoidance alone. In Louisiana, that proved sufficient. As the decade wore on, institutional memory thinned. Parish officials rotated. Clerks retired. What had once been a case became an irregularity in filing systems, a blank where continuity should have been. Yet even stripped of context, the land continued to exert influence. In 1956, a state planning commission proposed a secondary road that would have cut directly through the tract. The plan advanced through early stages without objection. Then, without formal vote or recorded dissent, it was revised. The road curved south instead. No memo explained the change. One engineer later remarked to a colleague that the soil samples taken from the area had been unremarkable. It wasn't the ground, he said. It was everything else. When pressed, he declined to elaborate. Around this time, a wildlife officer patrolling adjacent land reported unusual patterns in animal movement, game traveling in wide arcs around the tract, predators avoiding it entirely. He submitted his observations as routine data. The report was archived without comment. In a private notebook, the officer speculated whether animals recognized something humans did not. If there was training, he wrote, maybe it didn't stop at the animals intended. The line was crossed out. The old spur trail was now fully reclaimed by forest, yet aerial photographs revealed a faint linear thinning where it had once been. Even from above, the boundary remained legible. Those few who still spoke of the gathering did so carefully, framing it as a cautionary tale rather than a historical event. The man was no longer named. The animals were no longer described. Only the result mattered, that something had been set in motion without a clear way to undo it. And so, in Louisiana, the place persisted as a quiet exception, resisting both development and explanation as if waiting were its final function. By the late 1950s, the case existed only as a pattern of decisions. Roads bent. Surveys stopped short. Stories trailed off. Nothing pointed directly to the land, yet everything adjusted around it. It was no longer necessary to remember why. A visiting anthropologist once remarked that some landscapes function as records without text. The land, she said, remembers behavior through response. She was not speaking of Louisiana specifically, but those who heard her recognized the shape of the idea. In parish meeting minutes from 1959, a brief discussion appears regarding unused acreage. One councilman suggested reopening certain parcels for development. Another responded simply, not all of them. The matter moved on. No one claimed to hear calls anymore. No prints were reported. Whatever had once been present no longer announced itself. The absence itself had become stable. Yet travelers passing near the old boundary continued to describe a sensation of being slowed, not physically, but attentively, as if the place required acknowledgement even without engagement. The Florida panther by then had become a symbol of conservation rather than fear. Its documented behavior stood in quiet opposition to the older accounts, unresolved and unchallenged. The discrepancy remained unspoken. The story had reached its final stage, not disappearance but dormancy. In Louisiana, the land remained untouched not because of law or superstition, but because restraint had proven effective. And so the case concluded without conclusion, its lessons embedded in avoidance rather than record. By the early 1960s, no document could be said to contain the story in full. What remained existed between records, in the space where explanation gives way to habit. The land was still there, unmarked, undeveloped, and quietly intact, holding its place without assertion. A final review of parish archives that decade listed the tract among non-productive holdings, a category that required no further action. The designation effectively sealed its fate. Nothing would be built. Nothing would be recovered. Nothing would be asked of it again. Those who lived nearby continued to pass it without comment. They did not speak of fear. They spoke instead of respect, though none could say for what. The memory of the gathering had thinned to an impression that something once listened there, learned there, and was never properly dismissed. The Florida panther, now firmly understood through science and conservation, remained an imperfect reference point, a reminder that what happened in Louisiana did not align neatly with nature as it is usually observed. The difference was never reconciled. It was simply allowed to remain. No marker identifies the site. No sign warns a way. Yet even now people choose other paths. They say the air feels heavier, the silence more deliberate, as though the land itself were still attentive, holding the shape of an old signal. And so the case ends where it began, in Louisiana, on ground that remembers without speaking, waiting without urgency, listening without expectation.